Jeff Slauson here from 19 News Now at the 19 News Digital Desk. We are 4 days away from Election Day. Crazy to think that we are that close to the November 5th election here. And for many Ohio voters, early voting issues on the ballot have been very confusing. And I am talking in particular about issue 1. This is a redistricting amendment that has been presented onto the Ohio ballot. Essentially what this would do is this would replace the current way that we do political maps in the state in an attempt to end gerrymandering. Currently how we have it, 2 Democrats, 5 Republicans, which includes Governor Mike DeWine, currently write our maps, right? So they'll try and figure one out. Once they believe they have a map that is accurate and fair, they will present it to the Ohio Supreme Court. The Ohio Supreme Court can then decide if it's unconstitutional or not. And in fact, the previous time that they redid these maps, which need to be done every decade, they determined that the maps were unconstitutional not once, not twice, not 3 times, 7 different times. So the group, Citizens Not Politicians, decided that issue 1 would be something that could potentially change this. What issue 1 would do is it would create a 15-person board with no politicians on it at all. 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents. These people would be able to then write up all of the maps, present them to the Supreme Court under the same guidelines, and then potentially see if it could be constitutional or not. But the idea here is that it would be more fair than having 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Now, the board isn't designed for 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats. It's supposed to be 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then the governor appoints 2 other people. The governor's a Republican, he appointed 2 other Republicans. That's how you get the 5-2 majority. Again, 7 times the maps were deemed unconstitutional before they were agreed to. So very clearly, there's been an issue in how maps are done within the state of Ohio, but the answer's been a little confusing. Now, the amendment, again, as I explained it, is just a little tricky when you actually get to the ballot. It's written pretty confusing for some people. They will read it a certain way online, and then they'll go and the ballot language will be different. That is done by the ballot board. The ballot board is run by Secretary of State Frank LaRose, 2 other Republicans, and 2 Democrats. Again, that leaves a majority of 3-2 there, but they write the ballot language. Then there was a lawsuit by the Citizens Not Politicians saying, look, the ballot language is confusing, and the Supreme Court here in the state of Ohio, which is majority 4-3 Republicans and Democrats, said the language will remain. And ultimately now we are here where there is a ballot with very confusing language and many people unsure of exactly how they should vote on it, even if they either agree or disagree with it. I spoke with Jonathan Enton, professor at Case Western Reserve University, who you're going to be hearing a lot from over the next couple of days. He's going to be part of our digital panel for election night about this. And his expert opinion, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. He has seen issues like this multiple times, and according to him, the language in this should have been overturned. It is incredibly, incredibly strange when it comes to an issue on a ballot. I'm going to play now the interview that I did earlier today with Professor Enton. The reason for today, you and I spoke on the phone about this, is the potential confusion that we've been seeing with issue 1 specifically. The language that is on it is drastically different than, for a lot of people, what they read online, potentially doing their own research, and maybe changing their judgment. We actually did speak to people who said they were planning on voting one way, got into the booth, read what was on the ballot, and then changed their vote. So just to kind of start on this, how is the language determined for something like issue 1 to be on the ballot?
Once a ballot issue qualifies, the language that goes on the ballot is approved by the state ballot board. The ballot board is chaired by the Secretary of State, and it contains appointed members by the House and Senate leadership of both parties. So it's structured to have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and the Secretary of State. The ballot board approves the language, and if either the sponsors of the issue or an appropriate opponent thinks that the ballot language is not a fair and accurate summary of the proposal, they can ask the Ohio Supreme Court to tell the ballot board to go back and do it right. this time with issue one, we have a long, I think it's close to a 17-page proposal if you read it all the way through. Uh, so it's not practical to put the entire proposal on the ballot. So you need a summary. Now, the summary that the ballot board approved, I think, was pretty one-sided. I think it's fair to say that the words that the ballot board approved can somehow be traced. If you use a dictionary, you can trace most of those words back to something in the actual proposal. But words have both denotative meaning, that is, this is what they mean if you just look at the word objectively. But they also have connotative meaning, that is, there are implications to words. So you can use different words for the same concept. One of which might be kind of neutral or impartial, and the other of which sort of implies something negative. And there are lots of places in the ballot language, I think, where the words that the ballot board approved do have that sort of negative implication. Now, it's also worth noting, as I said, the ballot board is bipartisan, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and the Secretary of State. Secretary of State's a Republican, and all of the language was approved on a party line vote. The 3 Republicans voted for it, the 2 Democrats voted against. After that happened, the sponsors of issue 1 went to the Ohio Supreme Court and asked the court to declare that the ballot language was not fair and impartial. And the Supreme Court, which has a 4-3 Republican majority, voted on party lines 4-3 to uphold the ballot language. Now, I still think that the ballot language is not fair and impartial, but that's the ballot language that everybody is looking at. And so if people are relying only on the ballot language, they're going to see something that is skewed in opposition to issue 1. Now, it's not like you go into the voting booth and you should expect to have a detailed set of arguments for and against, right? And there are some better and worse arguments for and against issue 1. But I think people should not rely on the ballot language. Whatever they think about issue 1, they shouldn't rely on the ballot language, because the ballot language really does seem to me to be skewed to encourage people to vote no.
It's interesting hearing you say that, because, yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, unfortunately, they don't do their research ahead of time, right? They walk in, they will vote based off of party lines, and then for something like issue 1, this is potentially the first time they are going to be reading it, other than seeing a sign that tells them either to vote yes or vote no on it. One thing you said that was really interesting there, you talked about like the convoluted language on it. I have read through the way that it is positioned on the ballot here. It is pretty long. Obviously, you can't have the full 17 pages. The actual way that it is positioned, though, having an issue with that much text to it, is something like that also kind of a tactic, or potentially could be a tactic in a way, basically to include so much language that somebody could get incredibly overwhelmed with the information?
Well, maybe. I can't really get too far into the heads of the folks on the ballot board. That's just not something that I know anything about. But
sorry to cut you off. Just really quick clarification, I guess, in what I'm trying to ask here. Like, is that unusual to have that much language in an issue like that and have it be? It's basically like a page and a half.
Right. Well, it's unusual, but keep in mind that this is a fairly complicated measure to begin with, and so it's it's not like you could just have like a single paragraph with like 200 words and capture everything that is in there, right? The ballot language doesn't necessarily have to have every last detail, but it does need to give some kind of a sense about what's in the proposal. Now, for folks who haven't actually done their research before going to vote, the full text of issue one is actually posted at every polling place. But if you if you go to vote and you're not sure what you about this, you can actually take the time to read the whole 17 pages. That'll take a while, even if you read it fairly quickly. Um, and so there's a real question about how complicated an issue can be in order for folks to vote for it. Um, you know, there's a kind of an old adage among political experts that the more complicated a ballot measure is, the less likely it is to pass because people will have a hard time figuring out what it's about, and that will be true whatever actually appears on the ballot. Whether the ballot language is skewed in one direction or not, the more complicated it is, the more likely some folks are going to look at that and say, man, that's just more than I can deal with. And there are so many things that might go wrong along the way. So maybe this isn't such a great idea. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that unlike our previous anti-gerrymandering redistricting proposals, which had broad bipartisan support, this time around, the Republican Party generally is opposing issue one, and Democrats are more supportive. And it might well be that the fact that there's a party split on this could make a difference in addition to whatever effect the ballot language might have.
One thing that we spoke on when we were talking on the phone earlier, you mentioned the quote unquote fair and accurate summary is kind of what is needed for something like issue one. You mentioned, and others have mentioned, that they do not feel that this is fair and accurate in the way that it is done. The Supreme Court saying, look, we're not changing the language, that was the last step, right? So basically, as soon as the Supreme Court said the language is staying, there was no other recourse to have it be clarified, right?
No, that's right. Right. And, people might agree or disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, but the Supreme Court has the last word here. Now, if the court had said that there were problems with the language, the court would not have rewritten the language. It would have sent the language back to the ballot board and said, look, here's what you need to fix. And presumably the board would do that. We've had some history of that recently. Last year with the Reproductive Rights Amendment, for example, there were challenges to to the ballot language. And the Supreme Court said that most of the language was legally permissible, but some of it was problematic. And so the ballot board tweaked the problem language that the court had identified, and then we went ahead and voted on it.
The last question that I have for you, you had mentioned that for some people, the more they read, the less enthusiastic they are about voting affirmatively for something. As I mentioned, we have interviews with people where they said, we showed them the ballot, and they basically kept reading, and the more they kept reading, it felt like their opinions did change on that. Moving ahead, moving forward on this, is there a way, or is there a service in place other than this ballot board that potentially could limit something like that or make it more fair? Or is this the end-all be-all, that the ballot board decides the language and the only recourse is for the Supreme Court?
No, that's the system that we have. Now, we could think about other possibilities, but this is the system we have. And in order to change that, we would have to change Ohio law. And if people are sufficiently unhappy about the way the system works now, maybe there will be a move in that direction. But I think it's not realistic to expect any significant change in the process.
So I did reach out to the Secretary of State's office, wondering why people are confused and their reaction to that. The response directly was, quote unquote, "The summary approved by the ballot board is fair, factual, and was upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court. It accurately identifies the substance of the proposed amendment. Ohio voters can find the ballot language, full amendment text, and official arguments both for and against the amendment by visiting our website." They list it. We also have that on our website. And then they go on to say the full amendment will be posted at voting locations in all 88 counties. So the moral of the story here, look it up before you go. The first time you're seeing what's on your ballot should not be when you actually have your ballot in your hands. Do the research ahead of time, read it in its entirety, understand what you want out of this. If you want to vote no, if you want to vote yes, again, as always, that is entirely up to you. However, being informed is very important on something like this when it is such a complex issue and can be seen as confusing on the ballot. All right, it's 1:45. We got 19 News at 3 o'clock coming up over on WOIO, Channel 19. We will see you there at 3 o'clock over on CBS. For now, I'm Jeff Slauson with 19 News. Have a great day. See everybody in a little bit.
19 News, now streaming on Samsung Smart TV. Search for Channel 1035.